So yesterday I mixed up the grays for my palette, and then today I've cut this little piece of Strathmore oil painting paper, and like I've said before, I use the reverse side so that it's a little bit smoother, has less texture than the front side, and taped it up. This is about 3 inches by 4 inches. And I want to do like a really simplified study. I had done this in Procreate, and I want to do just like a little sort of gumdrop person, just a really abstracted light study. In that study, I had used value 5 for the local color of the person, and then, color of the skin, and then I used value 3 for the shadow color, and then value 4 for the like darker light, intermediate tone, halftone, whatever you want to call it, and also for the reflected light. So obviously this is the black and white study, so I won't be addressing the idea of the chroma change or subsurface scattering, that kind of thing. But I wanted to do a value study since it would be a little quicker, and I just have a short amount of time to work, so I want to do that first. And then next I'll start to mix up the rest of the warm cool palette and then move into doing an oil study of the warm cool version of this little abstracted person, so that I can show how I would approach the chroma in an oil painting similar to how I did in the Procreate study. So I have some brushes here, and I'm just going to be quickly blocking them in. This is going to be a little bit different than the color studies I've done before, where I don't blend them. Like this one, for instance, this is what we call a poster study. And the poster study, it's important that you don't blend the tones together, that you leave them pretty discrete, pretty separate. In this study, I'm going to be blending because that's kind of what I was doing with the Procreate. I kind of want to do a similar idea. You can, I think some artists call it a rounding study. So let's see. First of all, I think I'll take my pencil and just kind of sketch in just where I want to put the person's head. I don't want to make it too small because I want to be able to create some gradations, transitions. So I'm just trying to figure out if I have just kind of an oval for the head, and then I don't want to complicate things too much, but just kind of basically what I had in my Procreate study. I just want to place it on the little piece of canvas paper. It's beautiful. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and start blocking in. So I'm going to use a fairly wide brush. I mean, this is obviously a small brush, but in comparison to the size of the canvas paper, it's pretty large. So let's see. I'm going to go ahead and block in the background first, I think. So I'm going to go for a value 7 for that. Probably what I did in either 7 or 8. I think what I did in the Procreate study was kind of in between 7 and 8. So I'll go ahead and make it 8 and see how that looks. Okay, I think that's dark enough. So I'm just gonna kind of scrub that in. I want it to be opaque, but this paint has a lot of white in it, so it's going to be pretty opaque, so I can scrub it in fairly thinly at this point. And I'm not worried about the drawing, obviously. I just wanted to have kind of a placement of the little figure on the canvas. So I'm not too worried about the edge quality. Just surrounding the little person. All right, so now I'm going to go to a smaller brush, and both of these brushes are filberts, so they're kind of medium soft synthetic filberts. They're not the softest, but they're not bristle brushes. So I'm going to take the value 5 and actually I'm going to do it a different way than I did it with the Procreate, because with Procreate I laid on the whole figure in value 5, and in this case I don't want to do that. I actually want to paint the darks separately, not on top of the lights. So let me just grab this brush and I'm going to paint in the shadows first, because when I'm working in oil paint on a white canvas, I tend to like to work from dark to light. In this case, I put in the background first, but other than that, I want to work from dark to light. So I'm going to take value 3. And I want to be a little more careful, so I have my maul stick. And this is just another smaller filbert. So I'm going to lay in value 3. And in this case, I didn't leave a space for the reflected light because I kind of want that to brush into the shadow, as opposed to in the light I want to make it separate tones. The shadows tend to be more unified than the lights. There's a more subtle value change that's happening. So I might, even though I'm saying I want to use value 4 for the reflected light, it might not actually end up being that light once I brush it into the dark shadow tone underneath. So that looks pretty dark, but I haven't put in the tone for the skin yet, which is going to be a medium tone. It's not going to be like a super light person or a super dark person. It's going to be a medium toned person. So I'm going to put in the cast shadow now. And right now they're just merged together. So the cast shadow kind of falls onto the shoulder, and then this form itself has a little form shadow on it as it rolls away from the light. So this egg-shaped form is rolling away from the light, and there's the shadow edge, and then this gumdrop shaped form is rolling away from the light, but it also has this cast shadow from the form above on it as well. So, like I said in the previous video, this is the first time that I'm oil painting since my baby was born, so it's pretty exciting. It's nice to get back into it. That's why I started with something just really simple. Okay, so that's the shadow, and then I'm just brushing my brush stroke direction to be kind of going with the direction of my light source. I don't mean the light source in the painting, although it's very similar. I mean the window that I'm using as my light source for the painting, not in the picture of the painting, but on my painting itself, so that it doesn't have so much glare. So that's just a little trick that I try to avoid too much glare on camera and also from my viewpoint. All right, so now I'm gonna use a different brush for each tone until I get to the blending parts. So I'm just gonna grab, ooh, this is a nice one. I don't know if I've used this much yet. It feels newish rather than being all roughened up from painting with it. So this is another filbert. It's a little bit kind of in between the one I started with and then the two smaller ones I was using. I'm gonna do a intermediate tone for the reflected light and for the like dark light or the halftone. So for that, I want to choose a value 4. Oops. And choose a value 4 because that's going to be in between my shadow color and my my local color for the skin. So I'm loading up enough paint on my brush that I'm covering the white of the canvas. So if you look at the shadow color, it should look fairly flat. So I'm not putting too much on that it's going to be really blobby and get in the way of me, kind of smoothing it down. But I want enough that it's going to cover the canvas. That's why I like to mix up these big piles. So I'm going to do this first, and I'm just going to lay it down first without blending it together. I'm going to get a little bit more and put it down here. So this is the area that it's still receiving some of the primary light. It hasn't fallen into shadow yet, but it's getting darker because the form is rolling away from the light, so the light's not hitting it as directly. It's receiving less light, but it's still receiving some of the primary light. And then I'm also going to do a little bit of an edge here. So this is what we would call a penumbra for the cast shadow. A penumbra is just where the cast shadow at the edge kind of softens and lightens a little bit. It's structurally different than the darker form light, or what we would call the halftone, but it's often a similar value. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of I'm going to wipe my brush a little bit on the palette to get some of the paint off, and I want to paint the reflected light under the chin. I'm just going to brush that in. Okay, and I'm not going to blend it right away, but I'm going to brush it in. And often the reflected light kind of washes out the shadow along that edge where this form underneath the chest or the shoulder is bouncing light up and kind of washing out that shadow edge. So if it's really bright here, it's facing up toward the light, it's going to wash out that shadow edge a little bit. Okay, so now I'm going to go to my value 5, and I had already chosen a brush for that. So I'll go back to that brush. And I'm going to just fill this in flat. So what happens with when a rounded form, well, if you imagine a sphere, if you have a rounded form like a sphere that is turning away from the light, the rate at which the light diminishes accelerates as you get towards the shadow. So there's often like a large area of, if you're posterizing it like this, which I'm doing at the moment, before blending, there's often a larger area of light that you would make the same value if you're averaging it, and then a smaller band of dark light or halftone before you get to the shadow. So that halftone or dark light is kind of where the value starts to accelerate and get darker more quickly. So if you bring that dark too far up, it's not going to feel quite right. It'll feel like a different sort of shape. Oops, I think I grabbed the wrong color there. I'm just going to wipe my brush off. I grabbed some of the value 4, so I want to wipe my brush off and get more of the value 5. All right, and then as I'm kind of trying to fill in that edge, I'm starting to blend a little bit. And I'm gonna suede my brush strokes again, meaning that I'm just brushing them all in the same direction so that I don't get a glare for myself or for the camera. And I want to do this bottom part too. And because I painted this one value 4 stroke kind of all along that edge, I didn't suede it. I didn't brush the glare away. So I'm going to do that now. The reason to do that is mainly to be able to see the actual values more clearly. I can't say that word clearly. But to be able to see the actual values more clearly. Because the glare will interfere with how the values appear. All right, so going to the bottom form with value 5. So that's the local color of the object, or in this case, the skin, the torso of this gumdrop person. So again, I'm somewhat scrubbing to make sure I get into the texture of this canvas paper, but I want to make sure that I'm not just scrubbing it in transparently, that make sure that I have enough paint on that it's going down opaquely. Now if I were to just blend this as it is, it might work, but it tends to work better if you put more paint on your brush first. So what I could do is mix up intermediate tones, so mix in between the values to start to blend. I think what I want to do first is maybe put in the highlight color before I start blending. So for that, I'm going to use a smaller round brush. Well, actually, maybe I'll just use a small filbert to pop that in. And I think I used a value 8 for the highlight, and then, but I blended it out a lot as well. So okay, so the highlight is going to be somewhere, like if this is the lightest area, the most light facing area if our light is coming from kind of like from this direction, this would be the most light facing area, and the highlight's going to be somewhere in between that and our viewpoint, like our eye direction. So this is going to bounce off and then go towards our eye. So I'll just make it a little lower down like that, and it's brushing into the paint underneath, so that's definitely not a value 8. That's resulting. It's not as light as that is. Also, this background might be a little lighter than value 8 because I didn't, I kind of scrubbed it in and I didn't have it as opaque as I've been doing with the figure itself, because I did want it to be maybe a little lighter as I was looking at the. Okay, so that's a little closer to value 8, and I'm just going to leave it as that little blob for now. So for blending, I want to be using soft brushes, and I want to be mixing intermediate tones. So rather than, like I said, rather than just blending what's on the canvas, I want to use mix intermediate tones first and then blend those together. So I'm just looking to see what might be a good brush for that. So I have this one which is pretty soft, and it's another filbert. I have a lot of these filberts in different, they're all pretty small, but like in various sizes, in the small to medium size, and in various softness you know, ranges of softness. So this one's pretty soft. So I'm going to mix in between the, let's see, maybe I'll start blending into the light because that will keep the shadow edge distinct for now, which is good. So what I would want to do is mix in between values 4 and 5. So I'm not going to worry about the highlight yet. That's going to be a little more subtle. So I'm going to mix in between value 4 and 5 to get a tone that I can kind of work in this zone to blend the 4 and the 5 and the 4 together. So I'll just kind of do that to the side here, kind of in between. And I'm going to straddle this edge and just kind of gently go across. I'm going to do it again because it's kind of picking up the paint as I'm working. So, and you always want to think about when you're painting into another color that's wet, it's going to be, that underneath color is going to be picked up by your brush, so you have to really be conscious of you know, whether you're actually painting with the color that you want still, or if it's picked up another color that you're depositing somewhere where you don't want it. All right. So that's starting to look a little more of a rounded form rather than a posterized sort of stripy thing. Now I don't usually use like a soft blender brush to blend, but what I do sometimes do is like a soft fluffy brush to suede the paint, again to get rid of the glare. So I'm just doing this. It may be blending a little bit, but it's mostly just making the brush strokes so that there isn't as much glare. So now I'm going to do the same thing down here and just get some of that intermediate color. I'm just going to kind of work along that edge. And I'll also do it along here, along the what did I call it? The penumbra as well. So here I just took a dry brush and I'm kind of flicking some of the value 5 back over the edge of that penumbra. But as I do that, you might see that tiny little bit of, tiny speck of darker color that I deposited. I think the light is changing a bit because it's overcast and it's getting later in the afternoon and close to evening, and like I have a small north light window in this room, so I've been using it when I can for the light because I really like the north light, but of course I'm limited as to when I can paint, so sometimes I just have a small amount of time during the day when I can paint, so hopefully I can finish this little study to some degree before the light goes. All right, let's see. Yeah, before the light goes, and also I have to get back to my baby. All right, this shadow edge now I'm going to blend. So I'm going to use the same brush, and I cleaned it off mostly with the paper towel, but I'm just going to dip it in a little bit of water and then wipe it off with the paper towel again, just to kind of get some more paint out of there, because I want to move to some darker colors now. I want to mix in between the value 3 and the value 4. And because there might be a little bit of water left on my brush, I I want to make sure I wipe most of it off, but I also want to make sure I have enough paint on there that it's not going to be diluted too much with the water, because that's not very good for blending. It'll kind of poke through the paint in a way that I don't want. So here I have an intermediate tone, and I want to blend this so that it feels like it's rounding and turning, but I don't want to lose the specificity of my shadow edge. I want to soften it, but I don't want to lose it completely. So like this part, I could blend that out more, but this edge, I want to be careful how much I blend it. So I'm going to start by just doing the same thing, going along that edge. I'm lightly going across it again. I kind of went down the middle and then a little more to one side and then a little more to the other side. You can also kind of hatch like that if you have enough paint on there. Kind of like doing little hatch marks like this and then going across and blending those. But I'm trying to keep it pretty localized because I want to keep that again, the specificity of the shadow edge. And I realized that I had forgotten to put in the reflected light over here from the sky. So when I was thinking about the reflected light, I put in the one under the chin, but I forgot to put the reflected light over to the side. So let's go back to, I believe this is value 4. Okay, so I'm going to go back here. I'm going to brush in some reflected light on this side. It kind of washes out that shadow. I don't want to go too low because it's coming from the sky, which is above the person. And also on that shoulder, I don't want to go too far underneath the top form because that's going to be blocking the reflected light from the sky. And I should say it's reflected light, but I was calling it ambient light in the other study that I did. And again, this is mixing with what's underneath, so it's not going to be as light as value 4. And I'm just kind of blending that in as I'm painting it to some degree. Okay. Now the other thing I had noticed in the study that I did in Procreate is that this little top band of value 4, I want to actually bring the value 5 down. I think that was value 3. Okay. I'm trying to find the right brush that I was using. It was, I think that was value 5. Yeah, okay. So I'm just gonna kind of brush that down. And then I'm going to blend out this bit of reflected light under the chin. this shadow edge here. Sometimes I'll take the brush and kind of wiggle it like this. It's like an intermediate tone, and then kind of place it, kind of straddle the edge and wiggle it a little bit like that. That tends to work pretty well for kind of more simple forms. And I'll do a similar thing for the cast shadow. The cast shadow is going to be a little sharper near the form that's casting it, so underneath the chin. And then it's going to soften more as it goes, like soften and wide. The penumbra is going to widen as it goes out like that. Now I'm going to go back into the light area, and I want to mix, so I mixed a little bit of that intermediate tone with some more extra value 5, and I'm putting that, kind of laying that tone down, because we do eventually want to have some turning of the form in the light. The way that I paint, I don't, ultimately I don't want it to be completely flat in the lights. Some people do keep it pretty flat, but I like it to have some subtle turning of form. So I want to get rid of that band of halftone, and I want it to just make it be a continuous gradation. In this case, I'm painting just like a smooth form. Of course, if it's an actual face, there'll be lots of interruptions to that smooth gradation, and different subforms and features and things, but and I'm going to take my soft brush again and just kind of brush over that area. And I'll do a similar thing in the light over here. So just creating some subtle turning with kind of an intermediate tone between the value 4.5 that I did, the value in between 4 and 5, and 5. So it's a little closer to 5 than the intermediate tone. And so when I have this tone that's a little darker than 5, and I'm like starting here next to the band of the first intermediate tone I put down. And then as I move this way, it's picking up that light paint. So if I keep moving this way and then I suddenly go back here, it's going to deposit light paint down where I don't want it, right? So I have to go back and apply the darker paint on my brush and then work up this way again. I'm going to go back down to this darker intermediate tone and just kind of soften that penumbra shadow. And then back to the lighter one to kind of soften this edge a little bit. And then I'm just going to grab, with the same brush, I'm just going to grab some of value, let's see, I'm going to grab some of value 5 and trim that edge a little bit. Because again, like I said, I want it to be sharper next to the form that's casting it, and then softer as it moves away from the form. And let's see, I'm going to take some of the value 4 and just intensify that reflected light a little bit at the bottom of the chin. And I have a clean brush now. Basically I wiped it off and I'm just nudging, I'm gonna just nudge that shape a little bit. This is supposed to be just a really rough, abstract study, but I do want it to feel rounded, nicely rounded. So I'm just, let's see, some of that darker intermediate tone. Again, I just am trying to blend it out a little bit. So this is between values 3 and 4, and I'm gonna just work that shadow edge just a little bit, kind of reshaping it somewhat to be a little more rounded and less straight. So I wiped off my brush really well, and I want to go back to that intermediate tone between values 4 and 5, and then the one that has a little more of the value 5 mixed in. So I'm kind of have a progression on my palette now. I don't have like discrete puddles like I do these values, but it's basically, you know, what's kind of in this area. And I want to do the same thing, like just really subtly around here to get the form to turn. Because a lot of times what happens is, you know, the light, value 5 is supposed to be my local color, which means that it's, you know, well, if you don't think of this as a person, but think of it as like an object that's painted a certain color, that's the color that it's painted. And so in full light, it's going to be value 5. So in order to get the form to turn, aside from the highlight, so the highlight's something a little bit different, but to get the form to turn, I have to go darker than value 5, not lighter. To show the specular highlight, the specular reflection, I can go lighter, but that's kind of a different way of reflecting light. It's a little bit like you could peel it off and then see the matte form underneath. So what I want to do is just create a really subtle turn in the light using a color that's just slightly darker than value 5. So now I'm going back in with value 5 and kind of pushing that out a little bit. So if this is the zone that's the most light facing part of the egg shape, then I've darkened it slightly at the edge, and it's really subtle, and it might be less obvious because the background is so light compared to the person. So if I had used value 7 for the background, for instance, then you might be able to see that turn a little bit better, but there might be a little too much contrast right now to see that. So now I'm going to work with the lower torso part and do the same thing. So I have value 5, and then I'm going to go just a little bit darker. So I'm mixing a tiny bit of value 4 in, but not as much as I did for this area down here. I want it to be more like this area. And I'm going to be mixing into the value 5 too, so it's going to be lightening it up even more. But I just want it to be like a really subtle. So if the lightest zone is like right about here, I just want to slightly darken it down around that. You don't want to go too far because, again, like I said, the value accelerates, or the darkening accelerates as you get closer to the shadow. So in the light, there's usually just really subtle changes. If you have a simple form like this, like a simple rounded form like this. Obviously, if you have eye sockets and things, that's different, but okay. So I think, and I'm not putting highlight here, although I kind of think that in my study on Procreate, I had this higher up, so I think that the highlight, and I had like the neck kind of, or not the neck, but like the head kind of coming more down onto the gumdrop torso shape. So I think in this case, I may even see a little bit of a highlight like right there on the torso. So I'm gonna go ahead and lay that in just to see. So I went back to my value 8 brush, and I'm just gonna kind of pop that in. Maybe it's not quite as bright as the highlight up here. So in this case, because I'm painting on top of a value 5, I can use these intermediate steps, value 6 and 7, between 8 and 5, to brush out my highlight a little bit. Now, in this case, the amount that I'd want to brush out my highlight might depend on like how shiny the person is versus how matte. I think I mentioned in my last video that matte objects do still have specular reflection, it just gets spread out more. So it kind of diffuses across the surface, which is different than, I know there's a term like diffuse reflection, and that is usually talking about where the light is penetrating just a tiny bit into the object. So it's kind of like all objects except for metallic objects have a little tiny bit of subsurface scattering, because the light has to penetrate just a little bit into the object surface, below the object surface, to catch up the color, to kind of absorb the wavelengths that the color of the object is absorbing and then reflect the rest. It has to actually go into the object just a tiny bit. So this is kind of it's not usually talked about very much. Usually people talk about matte objects versus shiny objects, but the specular reflection doesn't so much have to do with the texture of the surface. It has more to do with something called well, I won't get into that right now, but it's basically, just think about, you're gonna have this highlight, and the highlight's either gonna be kind of spread out or it's gonna be really concentrated. If it's really concentrated, it's usually because the object is more glossy, like the person has really oily skin or a lot of sweat on them. If it's more spread out, maybe the person has powdered their nose, that kind of thing. So I'm going to take a little bit of value 6, and I'm just going to gently surround my highlight. And because it's brushing into value 5, it's getting darker. And then I'm going to take a little bit of value 7 and kind of go in between the highlight and what I just painted. And I'm kind of making little marks around the highlight, like almost little hatch marks around the highlight. I'm not going to try to make it perfectly smooth because that would be really hard. But I just want it to kind of diffuse a little bit. And I'm going to go back to value 8 and just reestablish the brightest spot. Now I wiped off my brush, and I'm just going to go around and brush that in to the value 5 a little bit more. So I've softened the edge of it a little bit, but I've kept it pretty concentrated. And for this one, because it's not as bright as this one, I'm just gonna I wiped off my brush, and I'm just gonna kind of do that and see what I think. I think it needs to be spread out more, so I'm gonna take some of value 7 and work around it a little bit. And then value 8 again in the center, but not as bright, not quite as bright as that. Okay, so now I'll wipe off my brush again and just give it a little bit of, just like barely touching the surface just to kind of break up the solidity of the highlight. So you can think of it as, when this highlight's more spread out, sometimes you can think of it as like a sheen, more of a sheen than like a sparkly highlight. I feel like maybe it's a little too subtle and maybe I should make it the same as that one. I'm gonna just take a little bit more value 8 to the center there. Okay. Let's see, I'm gonna go back to my blending brush and I'm gonna wipe it off and get some of the value 3 on there, and I'm gonna go around. I feel like that ambient light bouncing into the shadow was a little bit too, it wasn't really shaped properly. The reflected light needs to be shaped as well as the turning of the form in the primary light. The form turns towards the reflected light as well. Usually it's not such a distinct direction because it's more of like reflecting from a plane or an area rather than a small point or a smaller light source. But it's kind of, you want to think about like, where is the form turning towards the reflected light? So it's more concentrated here. Let's see if I'm going to get more of that value 4 and put it closer to where the ambient light is actually reflecting. Maybe the same thing up here. Just add a little bit more of that. Okay. So the other thing that I could do is work with the edges a little bit more, just to clean it up a little. So I could go to my value 8 brush and I think I kind of got. So sometimes with edges you can do that, like if you want them to be soft, you can do the same thing where you get a transitional tone and like straddle the edge and paint the transitional tone in. In this case, for the simplified study, I just want to clean up the edges a little bit. I don't want to get too much into the hardness and softness of edges. So I'm just gonna kind of take the value 8 and brush along it just to kind of slightly soften and make the edges not quite so messy. Just not even around the whole thing, but just where I see there's like little little weird things happening at the edge. I don't want to get it too blended because that's gonna just take me a long time. And also I don't want it to feel like it's just a hazy, like if you make all the edges soft then it doesn't feel right. It just feels like it's all out of focus, which is fine if that's what you're going for, but I'm just I like to have a mix of hard and soft edges. Okay, so that's probably enough on the top, and then on the bottom. One other thing I could think about is what's called the area of ambient occlusion, which means that it's an area that ambient light can't really get into. Ambient or reflected light can't really get into. And that would be, in this case, kind of already where we have an absence of reflected light. So we have reflected light under the chin, and then we have reflected light or ambient light hitting the shoulder. And then in this area here, that's like under the chin, where this light isn't bouncing in to the shadow. So I guess I would say not under the chin on the oval shape or the egg shape, but on the gumdrop shape. So like underneath the egg shape, there would be, you could make it a little darker there. I think it might look a little weird because it might separate the shapes too much. And in this case, you know, I'm kind of somewhat representing a person, and in that case, the person would be, like their head would not be really attached completely. So I don't know. I could try it and see what it looks like. I think I also want to, I'm going to go back to my kind of transitional color brushes, and I'm going to push, I'm going to get kind of a value in between 4 and 5. And maybe I'll lighten this value a little bit over here. Sorry, I don't mean to be whispering, but my baby is sleeping, so I... I'm going to push this edge out just a little bit. Feels a little sharp there, but I don't want to blend it in this way with the background color. I'm going to take it out this way with the... I think I need to get a little darker. I wiped off my brush and I'm just kind of gently going over that area. Maybe I'll use this brush to brush things down this way. Go into value 4 and just kind of adjust that shape. It needs to get lighter. And I was trying to wash that part of the shadow out a little bit, and so I think I just needed to work on it a little bit more to get it feeling right. Okay. have dragged the reflected light under the chin a little too far this way, so I'm going to go into the value 3, and I'm just using that same brush and bring it back a little bit like that. Like that. So I could take a little bit of value 2 and see what it looks like right in that area, where there would be an absence of reflected light and an absence of ambient light. And that could be sometimes called the occlusion shadow or ambient occlusion. Another thing we could think about is, because this person has like medium tone skin, something that happens in darker skin a lot is, you know, this ambient light that's bouncing into the shadow and in the dark light, sometimes there's actually reflections that happen on the side of the head as well. So a reflection from the ambient light, like a specular reflection from the ambient light. So we could think about putting something like that up in here. But I think I'm probably not going to do that for this study, just because I want to kind of wrap it up at this point. I see that from some angles there's a little bit of glare right here. So when you're doing this, you want to have a really light touch, and if you think you've picked up too much paint with this like sueding brush, I guess you could call it, you can wipe it off on a paper towel. Don't use solvent or water though, because it will not be good to drag that across your painting if you're gonna do it again. All right, let's see. I'm gonna do the same thing with the background. Just the background, I wasn't so concerned that it not have glare, but just kind of be consistent. Okay, so I think when I did that, I got a little bit into the shadow here, so I'm gonna brush the opposite way to make sure it doesn't interrupt my shadow color.